weather was lousy the day I went to see a new 3-person show at the Delaware Art Museum, but the art is magnificent. Moe Brooker, Bryan Dickerson, and Alan Soffer are all highly accomplished abstract artists. There is a theme that runs throughout the show. Shakespeare called it the undiscovered country and pointed out that it's the place from which no traveler returns. Each of these artists have had their aesthetics in some way shaped by the notion of death and mortality. For Bryan Dickerson, who is in his mid-60s, it happened when he was growing up in the small farming village of Middleburg in upstate New York.
Most of my time growing up, again, was spent playing up in the mountains and in the fields. I think I was 16 years old at the time. They found an Owasco Indian settlement site that was excavated by the state archaeologist. This was very big news in our village. There were a lot of stories about skeletons that were found and uncovered. And I remember visiting this site and looking into the cache pits and the burial sites and seeing artifacts and bones and the stakes that were in the ground and the various layers of soil. And this made a big impression on me, more so from an event that took place when I was 6 years old. And I had an older brother, Noel, who was 13, and he died in a fishing accident. And of course, an event like that completely changes the whole dynamic of a family. At 6 years of age, it certainly impacted my life and has affected, to some degree, the work that I'm doing today.
My name is Moe Brooker. Painted for a long time. I wonder if I'll ever feel comfortable painting. Painting is always an exciting challenge. I many times feel lost in the process of making, but because of the process that I use, I try to find a solution.
For 78-year-old Moe Brooker, a seminal event occurred when he was a young soldier stationed in Korea.
I was a realistic painter for a long time. When I was in Korea, I saw a Korean funeral, which struck me. Now, you have to understand this because my dad was a pastor of a church. I've had my round of funerals, and everyone's wearing black. This funeral, the cart that carried the body was multicolored, blazing. Well, that's when I began to move away from realistic work, and I moved toward color. And I studied what colors they use. There seems to be a sense that something wonderful is going to happen relative to death, as opposed to something not so wonderful is going to happen in the West in terms of death.
Hi, I'm Alan Soffer. I'm an abstract expressionist painter working primarily in encaustic, although in this show I'm sort of half and half between encaustic and drawing materials and acrylics on canvas. So it's a third and a third and a third.
81-year-old Alan Soffer has been known for intense colors, but for this show, that has changed.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I was teaching a workshop with Libby and a psychologist called Creating from Passion. Part of it was we did a very deep meditation to find out what was going on inside of ourselves. I wasn't too hot about this, but I thought, well, I'm teaching, I better participate just like everyone else. Lo and behold, I have to think about my death. I'm coming to the end of my life cycle here, and I haven't given any thought to this. And that was what led me into working with black and white. It seemed like that was an appropriate way to work for this particular concept. Most abstract artists don't do drawings, preparatory work. We just plunge right into the art itself. And I wanted to do drawings in their own right, to be the end product.
I saw some work about 4 or 5 years ago at a gallery in New York by artist J. Kelly. They were very, very small drawings on vellum. I want to try this with encaustic.
Hot wax with pigment.
Which I did. It led to the Unconscious series. Suddenly I'm doing drawings with charcoal and ink and pens and all the stuff that people who traditionally have done drawings do. But they're working from a model, a still life or something. I'm working out of my head. It's not easy to come up with something that is useful and has some potency. I love doing them, and I'll probably continue doing this for a good long time.
I don't do preliminary drawings for paintings, but I draw all the time. I draw to discover options that are possible. And those options that are possible are never transplanted into a painting completely, but I will borrow a little bit of this and a little bit of that and put them together so that they begin to create their own sense of life. I used to go to the backside of the art museum just as the sun was going down. Some of the most amazing colors that you will ever see exist in nature. I take my sketchbook and I go out and I see the foliage and I see various colors in nature, and I will do little draftings of those colors. Why? All my colors come from nature. They change from year to year. I have never found a better palette than what you find in nature.
Bryan Dickerson draws quite a bit and often works out structural ideas for his assemblages through drawing. For instance, he told me the idea for pieces with multiple openings first came from drawings. Bryan also told me about how the materials he uses have changed over the years.
In my earlier work, I used to attach what I refer to are called artifacts. There were pieces of old buildings or barns, old window frames that had been charred and burned, and I would salvage those and attach them to the work. And for me, that was a way of branding the work and giving it a reference to the area that I grew up in. But then I realized that for the viewer, they would have no knowledge of that. It would be immaterial for them.
So now, though he makes it look like weathered wood, he starts with pristine lumber from Lowe's and Home Depot. Bryan started out as a painter of dark, moody landscapes. Seeing the evocative construction of the back of a medieval altarpiece made him switch from painting on canvas to assemblage.
The wood allowed me to carve, cut, scrape, gouge, the kinds of harsh techniques that were similar to the archaeology that I witnessed as a youngster. So there's a lot of, I would say, almost violence associated with the first stages of the painting. Very often the first part of the painting starts with very bright color. Bright yellows, bright reds, orange, blue, green. For some reason they just evolve and become darker and darker. And part of that might have to do with the personality associated with the work itself. And if you look very closely, you'll see those colors underneath certain sections. They do come through.
By the way, Bryan's are not the only three-dimensional pieces in this show.
I started out as a sculptor. First 12 years of my art making was all sculpture. And so I still do an occasional sculpture. I don't feature it because I don't have room to store all that stuff. But every time I have a major show, I do a couple sculptures. One is called Reaching and one is called Connecting, and it feels like part of being alive, and I love doing sculptures. These are built from piano keys. My wife Libby collects everything known to man. We're probably going to collect stuff in the trash here as we leave.
During a Q&A session at the opening, moderator Donna Usher asked about the idea of titles. Moe Brooker began with the title for the show itself.
Point Counterpoint is a good description of the work. The point is to make art. How you make the art becomes the counterpoint. We have different approaches. It's boring to walk in a show and see the same work over and over and over and over again. The very point that there's difference in each person's work and their approach is a wonderful sign. Music, that's where many of my titles come from. Listen with your eyes. Think about that for a moment. Listen, see with more than just a glance. John Coltrane had a relationship with Einstein and based his approach to jazz, which revolutionized in a number of ways jazz, on a mathematical component. Surprising to me. But music in itself is mathematical.
You can see mathematics in jazz come alive in Moe's work. The rhythmic geometric elements are like the bass and drums, establishing a platform upon which the improvisations of the painterly equivalent of a sax or piano or vibes can soar.
When you're painting, you develop an alphabet. You begin to use that alphabet in the same way that you use an alphabet in a language. It's pretty much set, but you use it in so many different combinations that it doesn't look the same.
For Alan Soffer, a title is a necessary component of communication between artist and viewer.
I think that the work needs a title, especially with abstract, because it gives the viewer some degree of entree to what you're trying to do. I do come up with titles eventually. You'll see that I have a lot of them titled Lotus. Years ago, I did work based on ancient healing. The Egyptians believed that the lotus represented the life cycle. The lotus, at the end of the day, would close up, fall asleep, and while it was asleep, they felt that life was dead. And when you were asleep, your life was dead. And then you woke up in the morning, and the lotus bloomed in the morning. So I didn't start out thinking that that would be a title, but there's one in the other room, Sleep Between Life and Death. This work that I'm doing is about the life cycle, and particularly the end of the life cycle, which is not pleasant to think about for some people, but in any event.
I talked to Bryan Dickerson by phone. He said he gave the title Descent to one of his assemblages in the show. Art history fans will see an allusion to Descent from the Cross religious paintings. Bryan said he was inspired by a series of 4 art books published by the editors of Phaidon Press. The books, each with 100 reproductions, are Annunciation, Last Supper, Crucifixion, and Descent. His attitude towards religion and spirituality is complex.
I was only about 8 or 9 years old. I'd make these little crude crosses and paint them with shellac and then take them up to the cemetery.
As a memorial for your brother to some extent?
Yeah. It's where my mom and dad are also buried.
He has spent time working in Ireland and is inspired by the standing stones he found there. He sees immense visual power in iconic religious symbols, and yet, speaking about his works,
The cross references might have played some part in the beginning stages of the work. They're not meant to be religious objects in any way, but they are quiet. They do tend to relate to the darker side of human experience, but at the same time, I think they're also very hopeful.
But I think there's definitely something greater than ourselves, but I view that as the power of nature. Maybe that touches on pantheism, but I don't believe in monotheism or an all-powerful God. I don't know.
5 years ago, Bryan had chest pains and needed a triple bypass operation. The experience didn't exactly scare him, but made him more aware of his own mortality. I asked him about death.
Losing my brother at a very early age has everything to do ultimately with the kind of work that I'm doing now. And the dilemma is that death is actually a gift. Andrew Wyeth was quoted as saying this when he talked about the death of his father. He said a death, especially if someone very close to you, gives you something that you can't get any other way. And so as tragic as it was and still is, without that, I don't know that I'd even be doing art. That's a hard thing to wrestle with. I need to justify this in some way. And how do you do that? Turn it into something that is positive. As a kid, you're there and you're trying to think, gee, he's in this box, he's in the ground. What could that be like? And then years later, when I saw that excavation, what was the closest thing to seeing what that would be like? To see these artifacts and bones buried into the ground. And then you could see the different sediments of soil, the discoloration in the soil. I remember the day that it happened. I remember everything about it, including the phone call when we got the phone call. The people that were at the house and the cars and the fire truck, and I was told not to go into the house, and I snuck in and saw my parents there, and I asked them what was wrong, and they said, well, your brother's not coming home. And I said, well, how long? He said, well, he's never coming home. And I said, well, can I have his room? So I went up into his room. I mean, I didn't really know what they were talking about, because I was, just 6 years old.
You joke about dying, but are you scared of it at all?
It's a good question. I don't want to die. I'll put it that way. I don't think about it, honestly. It's not like preying on me, like I'm going to go. But I do feel that there's some limitations as to what I'm going to be able to do in the next 10 years if I should live that long. That's not a long time. I feel like I have to really condense my efforts and push a little harder. So I don't have any answers. I know people are going to say, okay, you've been thinking about it, you're doing all this artwork, well, tell us, what is the answer? I don't have any answers.
John Thornton, who's doing a documentary film about this exhibition, asked me if I have made any discoveries of this that could be useful to you. And I have to tell you, I have not. As far as I am concerned, I'm here today and I'll be gone tomorrow. And that's all that I know. Now, Moe has a totally different, and I envy him for having this other approach to life. And I envy my friends who think they're going to go to utopia in heaven and you can eat fattening foods and not gain weight. What else? They're going to have sex 5 times a day. I mean, it's going to be fantastic. But I don't expect that, to be honest.
They also mean a lot to me because these frames were willed to me by Deborah Warner, who was a professor at Moore College. She had studied encaustic with me, and when she was passing, she asked her husband to give me these frames and a bunch of other stuff. So I get a little sentimental when I see these things because I think of Deborah.
So actually, Alan did have an answer of sorts. We live on in the memories of those who love us.
I have enormous belief in the human spirit and in people. Regardless of what the world is like right now, I want to make people smile, I want to make people laugh, and I want to introduce to people their own sense of spirituality, because that's what keeps us going. That's what keeps me making art. The substance of things hoped for. Do you know how powerful a hope is? A hope is unbelievably powerful. It's powerful. Hope gives you courage.
You mentioned courage.
Yeah.
And I also noticed you're a bit of a cyborg man today. Could you explain that?
A few weeks ago, I had a heart attack. This monitors my heart.
People say, are you afraid to die? I say, no. There's something there that I want to find out about. I want to see what it's like. So I really don't have a fear of death at all. Not at all. Kids in the Bronx, some of them never get out of the Bronx, but they would paint subway cars with their tag on it. And guess what? That subway car went all over the city, and their name was known. We strive for our names to be known in some way because it goes into the future.
I am so fond of these three artists. I taught with my dear friend Bryan Dickerson for 30 years at the Art Institute of Philadelphia. I've only known Alan Soffer for 4 years, but his good humor and kind spirit inspire me to no end. And I cannot say enough about Moe Brooker. Moe made my own creative life possible when back in 1975, he encouraged me, a deeply insecure 21-year-old, to follow my dreams and study art. Shakespeare points out that it's not death, but the fear of death that drives us nuts. But that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns, puzzles the will and makes us rather bear those ills we have than fly to others that we know not of. Thus conscience does make cowards of us all. But do we really need to be afraid? Whether you believe, like Alan and Bryan, that the experience of death will be a painless oblivion, or like Moe, that there is something wonderful around the corner. In either case, there is nothing to fear. Marcus Aurelius summed it up the best a few thousand years ago. And finally, waiting for death with a cheerful mind, as being nothing else than a dissolution of the elements of which every living being is compounded. But if there is no harm to the elements themselves, in each continually changing into another, why should a man have any apprehension about the change and dissolution of all the elements? For it is according to nature, and nothing is evil which is according to nature.